Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about EV adoption globally, as well as we're going to talk a little bit about the US as well. Now, before you click away, especially if you're somebody that has nothing, they want nothing to do with EVs, they're only going to buy internal combustion engines. I do not own an EV. I do plan on buying an EV, but it might not be for the reasons that you think that somebody would buy an EV for. I am not interested in ever buying a Tesla product. Part of that is I just don't trust the guy. But I'm not a Tesla fan person. I think their products are kind of ugly. It's just an egg driving down the road. But I don't want an EV because it is good for the environment or that kind of stuff. I tend to think that the EV will reduce the cost of my monthly bills. And most of what I've done on this channel is all about reducing the cost. It doesn't really have a lot to do with environmental impacts, although if you buy into everything that they say about the environmental impacts, yes, most of the stuff that I have done in my house or the things I plan on doing for EVs will be beneficial to the environment over the long haul. Not my top priority. That's nice. If that has that impact, that's great. But I really like having an $8 electric bill. That has nothing to do with the environment. I want that $8 electric bill. Ideally, free is even better. So if I could get it down to zero, I probably would. I like having my gas bill be about $20 a month. So I essentially pay to have gas in my house, but I also use it for my stove right now. And there are impacts of that. And I do want to switch that to say like an induction. But what I'm trying to say is I am not the person that is always had an EV, has been buying EVs for years. I don't have an EV. And part of that is because I'm on an SUV. I've currently got an SUV gas vehicle right now. I don't drive a lot, so it's not a huge priority for me to get it switched over to EV. Obviously, the cost right now, I think a lot of people are considering EVs. Surprisingly, they're still holding out. And depending on when you bought a vehicle, it might not be financially sound decision to buy an EV, even if you could save thousands of dollars per year just by charging your vehicle. Or maybe you rent. There's a whole bunch of people in my situation where I have a house and I've got solar and battery and I've made those investments. An EV makes a lot of sense for my situation. But again, this is me saying I'd like to get an EV, but only because I don't want to have to pay for the cost of the gas, and I don't want to have to pay for the maintenance costs. So if it's good for the environment, great. If it isn't, hey, I'm not making that argument. So don't put that in the comments like they do a lot more damage to the environment pulling the lithium out of the ground, although I tend to think that's misinformation because it's a renewable resource. So yes, it does do damage to the environment when you pull it out, but you can reuse it. So you can ground that battery back down and reuse its components again and again and again. You can't do that with gas. So I tend to think there's a lot of misinformation out there about which one is better or worse for the environment. It's kind of hard to make the argument that something like oil is not bad for the environment with all the potential things that happen when you drill for oil. But lithium does damage the environment. I get it. But again, not my primary focus. I saw an interesting article and it was about EV adoption. And I wanted to do a kind of a quick video on that. So let's talk about it. Let's get into it. Now, this is the article that I read, and it's the global EV sales to hit 27% of the market in 2026, despite US policy headwinds. And there's another page that if you kind of go through and read this, and I'm going to put the link for this in the description of the video, so don't worry about it. I'm going to put that in there if you want to read this. The referenced article that that previous one was based on is this one. Again, I'm going to put the link for this in there. It's got some pretty good information and some interesting charts in here, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time scrolling through this article and talking about it. I pulled what I thought were the relevant pieces from both of these articles, and I put together kind of a couple things that I wanted to talk about based on the content that was in there. So we're going to focus on that. But again, if you want to read the full articles, I'm going to put those in the description. Go ahead and check that out if you want to read the articles. Full disclaimer, there are articles like this that come out pretty much every couple of weeks or so. I've been reading a lot of these articles especially from a global perspective on what's going on with EV adoption. The US, obviously, we're in kind of this strange situation where people are adamantly opposed to getting EVs, plus costs are so high. So what's going on in the US is a little different than what's going on in the rest of the world. But I think it's important for us as Americans in the US to understand what's really going on outside of the US. We tend to get a little too focused on what's going on inside the US sometimes and lose focus of what's going on in the entire planet, because what happens everywhere else will impact us eventually, maybe not immediately, but it will long-term have impacts on the US. So what are some of the things I took away from the article? Some of the key numbers: 23.3 million global EV sales in 2026 so far. 27% of new passenger car sales in 2026 are EVs. From 9% to 20% global EV share in just 5 years. That's a significant increase to go from 9 to 27% in 5 years. So I thought that was a pretty important number to take a look at. And then 52% of new passenger car sales will be EVs by 2035. So more than half, which is a lot, right? So we're getting there. Now, again, the US is not going to be at 52%. But there are a lot more people on the planet than what just the US has, right? So the US has a couple 100 million, whereas the entire planet is billions of people. So what happens globally does have an impact on the US. By 2047, EVs are expected to become the majority of passenger vehicles on the road. So we will finally break that 50% mark of all vehicles that are operating, not just the new vehicles that are being sold, but all vehicles on the road are expected to be EVs. And then the amount of energy from 367 terawatt hours to 2,700 terawatt hours going from 2025 to 2040. So yes, as we've heard over and over again, an enormous amount of energy in order to go to EVs, which is why they've said in the US, our grid is not sufficient to make that happen. We can barely handle the increase from AI and data centers, much less the EV transition in the US. And I think this is very important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the impacts of this later down the road. This is just kind of setting the groundwork of what was in that article there. Now, it is important to understand when they say EV, they're talking about battery electric, plug-in hybrid, and range extended electric vehicles. So it is not just your typical battery electric vehicle that we're talking about. And again, the source is these articles that I previously mentioned. Now, if we take a look at where EV growth is moving, and again, it's best to look at this from a global market story. The US is obviously down. This administration has been doing everything they can to switch over to fossil fuels. I think we understand that. It's not entirely clear why we're pushing so hard to go to fossil fuels when the entire planet is going the other direction. But that is the situation that's going on in the US, like it or hate it. Again, I'm all about lower cost, but I tend to think something that you dig out of the ground that is a fossil fuel is a finite resource. No matter what, it is a finite resource. They are not making any more of it. When it runs out, it's gone. And I tend to think that we should keep these resources for the long term, because who knows what's going to happen. So the faster that we can switch over to renewables, I think the better. But renewables rely on, especially in the case of solar, for example, they rely on the sun. And there are a lot of things that can happen to our planet that would cause the sun to not be able to reach solar panels. For example, a nuclear war. So if we have a nuclear war and all of a sudden we have clouds everywhere and there's no more solar getting to the ground, that's a huge issue. Same thing happened when the dinosaurs went extinct and an asteroid hit the planet. We don't have a really robust space budget to defend against this kind of stuff. There's tons of movies that talk about it, but essentially a big rock hits the ground. Next thing you know, you're in a nuclear winter of, from a asteroid hit. So solar becomes less capable as soon as that is the situation. Now, if we still had resources, it would be much easier to then start using those to get off of the solar that we are, enjoying right now. So I tend to think that the finite resources have a purpose, especially in catastrophe. So when things all fail, and again, we need the sun in order to make solar work, and some of the other things will continue to work, such as the wind farms and that kind of stuff. But solar is a pretty good resource, and if we ever lose the ability to get that from the sky, then we have a lot of issues. And if you go back to, say, like the 70s, it was pretty bad in some of the bigger cities where solar would not have worked had we continued down that course in Beijing, New York, LA, where the smog was so bad. We could have had some serious issues if we had continued down that trajectory. So it is not impossible to say that something could happen in the future where we would need these sources. And if we've used them up because we didn't transition away from them fast enough, then it is no longer a viable option to fix a future catastrophe. So again, I'm a common sense kind of person. That's probably a very unlikely scenario, but it is at least documented in movies quite a bit. There's tons of movies that talk about the end of the world. We're really good at creating those kinds of videos and movies. So again, it's just what I consider to be kind of a common sense situation. Is it might be better to have a finite resource for when you have that kind of catastrophe. But again, the US, clearly we're not buying a lot of EVs right now, even with the gas prices, which I think is kind of surprising. But EVs are not cheap, and not everybody's in a situation. Again, if you don't have solar, you don't have a way to, maybe you don't have a house, you're renting, you're living in an apartment, you're living on campuses. There's a ton of scenarios out there where a EV is hard to have because the infrastructure is not there in the US right now. But everywhere else, there's momentum in Europe, India, Brazil, and Mexico. China's actually been getting quite a bit more into our South American counterpart down here, especially in Mexico area. So tons of Chinese EVs, which are a lot more affordable in the South American area here. And then we've got 63%. Again, China is obviously the biggest market for EVs. There's a huge push in China. So their adoption is, night and day between everywhere else, but definitely between the US and China. But then we've got Singapore, nearly 50% EV share in Singapore, Vietnam, 39%, Thailand, 27%, Turkey, 22%, Finland, and Norway. And there's a ton of European countries that are also doing this huge transition over to EVs, whereas the US is going the other direction. So from a global perspective, there's a big difference here on what's going on. But like I said, China, huge number here. 63% of their global EV sales in 2025 came from China. So definitely huge push in China to get over to EVs and away from oil. Now, because of the cost of oil, this has largely insulated China, or at least everybody that's got an EV in China. Plus, it's probably pushing more adoption because, again, the costs are kind of ridiculous for oil. So everything right now is pushing pretty much everybody except for the US to switch over to EVs. What is interesting, if the countries I mentioned, Norway, Finland, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, Turkey, not oil producing countries. And interesting enough, even among some of the OPEC countries, there's a huge transition to solar and EVs as well. So this is not universally adopted, but essentially, if you are not an oil-producing country, it is in your best interest to switch to renewable energies, EVs and solar and everything else, because it will shield you from OPEC and all the craziness of oil in the world. So there are a lot of benefits, and I think a lot of the countries, this is one of the reasons why they switch. And actually, that was something China wanted to do also, was to become less reliant on fossil fuels and more reliant on things that were easy for them to control, such as solar, battery, and EVs. Now, why people are buying EVs? Lower running costs. I mentioned that for myself in particular, or in the case of my friend that had the hybrid. So funny part about her, she bought a hybrid, told her, hey, that's not a good idea. The manufacturers would prefer you buy a hybrid over even an internal combustion engine, because a hybrid has all of your internal combustion engine components, and then it's got all of your EV components, and they put it into one thing. So you've got twice as much stuff that can go wrong. I'm exaggerating, it's not twice as much, but you get the picture. There's more stuff that can go wrong with that vehicle and more profit for the manufacturer because you're now buying twice as much stuff to maintain your vehicle. And in the case of my friend, they bought the hybrid, even though I said, hey, this is not a good idea, but they did. And one of their first bills was over $2,000 in maintenance costs, just maintaining the systems. And some of it, probably some maintenance issues that popped up. But again, very expensive for maintaining that hybrid. And in that case, it was a Toyota. Toyota makes fantastic hybrids, but they cost more to maintain. I would argue that they cost more than internal combustion, but I don't know that the data necessarily supports that. We have to take a look at it long term, but I think what we're going to find is that they cost more than an internal combustion engine to maintain in the long run. There are more affordable EV options, especially with Chinese vehicles. So where Chinese vehicles are being imported, it is much more affordable than Western-built vehicles. So it tends to be a very cost-effective approach to switch over to an EV, especially if the charging infrastructure is there or they have the ability to charge it from their home. Less maintenance, definitely a fact there for less maintenance costs. Home charging convenience. Now, again, not everybody has that benefit, but these are all the things that kind of go into this picture of why would you want to get an EV. Better driving experience. Now, some diehard internal combustion engine people that love their vehicles, love the sounds, love that roar of doing that. I could care less. That's something that gets me excited is hearing my vehicle. I could care less about that aspect. So I think there's a lot more people that don't really care about that, especially when you talk about the instant torque that you get with an EV. So you can go from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds on an EV. Pretty ridiculous speeds are possible. So I tend to think that there are a lot of people, especially the younger generation. I remember being young and it was awesome to be able to go fast and to be able to go fast very quickly. 0 to 60 speeds like that for an EV is definitely something that people are looking for. Maybe not me, I care less about that, but I do like to merge onto the interstate and not have to worry about whether I can speed up or get to where I want to go. Right now, energy and fuel security is definitely big. I have a video I put together that kind of went through the cost breakdown of this. I'll put that up in the video here. You can go ahead and check that out if you want to see. In my case, again, I only drive about 3,000 miles per year. So for me, yes, it would be cost effective, but it's not the same as somebody that drives 15,000 miles or 30,000 miles a year. People that drive that much would save thousands of dollars by switching over to an EV. It almost pays for itself, especially if you have solar battery and the ability to charge it at home. So what's the big picture though? EVs are becoming easier to afford, cheaper to operate, and more practical to own. I think I saw someplace where the cost of building these batteries has been cut basically by 50% again. So creating these batteries gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And now we've got the sodium batteries that are coming out. I expect they'll be a little bit more costly initially, especially as they kind of ramp up their production. And I think the range is a little bit lower on some of these, but it's a new technology. So I think that with sodium batteries, we're going to start to see that the cost goes down significantly. Eventually, I suspect that the range will get to where it needs to be, and it'll be on par or closer to at least a lithium battery. Now, what is the timeline that the article suggested? I don't know that this will hold up to be true. It'll be interesting to look back at this video as we start getting to some of these year markers and see exactly, were they accurate, were they behind, or were they ahead? But they're saying that essentially road transport for oil demand will peak in 2029. So essentially, demand for oil continues to go up pretty much every year. But in 2029 is when they're saying that increase will drop. Now, oil is used for a lot more than just the gas. So even if we stopped every internal combustion engine out there, we would still need to drill for oil because we need it for a lot of other stuff, plastics, and it's all over the place. Oil is literally part of just about everything in modern society. So just because you stop using the gas doesn't mean you stop doing drilling for oil. By 2033, robotaxis exceed 1 million vehicles. I think we're pretty on track to hit that. I would not be surprised if we hit that before 2033. There's been lots of advancements with full self-driving and some of the technologies. I think Rivian's saying by the end of this year that they'll be able to do kind of point-to-point also. So we're getting very, very close for robotaxis. And I can see that. I know initially a lot of people will be hesitant to get into a robotaxi, but I think it'll eventually catch on once it's been proven as a safe technology, assuming that it actually is proven as a safe technology. I'm still a little skeptical, especially in certain environments where maybe it's a lot of snow or bad weather, that kind of stuff. And then by 2035, your electric passenger vehicles become 50% of the sales. By 2040, over 2/3 of car, van, and truck sales are electric. So pretty amazing numbers if we actually pull that off. By 2047, passenger EVs on the road outnumber your internal combustion engine vehicles. I could see that. I could see that definitely getting there, especially if the price of gas doesn't start to go down in the next years and years. It's going to continue to push people over to EVs faster and faster, the longer the gas prices are higher. And then by 2050, 645 million tailpipe emitting passenger vehicles still on the road, but that will be significantly less because of EVs. So still a lot of vehicles on the road, but we're going to start to see a decline of the number of vehicles in comparison to the number of EVs. We still have vehicles on the road, and some of these vehicles were built in the 50s and 20s, so we've still got a robust number. I think a lot of the vehicles that we see on the road in 2050 will be not purchased as internal combustion engines, but the classic or kind of those old-time vehicles. It'd be funny to refer to a vehicle that was built in 2026 as a classic, but I suspect by 2050, some of the vehicles built today will be considered classic vehicles. The key thing is that EV sales will grow first, but the vehicle fleet changes slowly. So it still takes time. Just like your rollout of EV chargers, a very slow process. We've got 100,000 or more gas stations out there. Eventually, we will start to see a situation where there are more EVs on the road and you will have less gas stations. They'll start going out of business because they just aren't, they don't have the vehicles that need them. I don't think that will apply necessarily on your interstate travel. But California, certain areas of California, I suspect that we'll see the gas stations start to go out of business because there aren't enough gas vehicles that need those. So again, they're transitioning much quicker over to EVs than pretty much anywhere else in the US. So I think that'll be kind of our first place where we start to see news articles saying the gas stations start going out of business because there aren't enough gas vehicles, which would be interesting to see. All right, so then what are the big questions and what are some of the potentials if we had actually gone the route of trying to go into the EV side? So some of the questions, let's start there. Can we eventually get the policy stabilized? I don't know why this is a political thing where the GOP is all for fossil fuels. I do know why. It's about money. It's about lobbyists. The oil industry throws a lot of money at politicians. That's why. That's where that comes from. Will affordable EVs reach mainstream buyers? This is, I think, about the capabilities. I would buy an SUV right now. If I needed it, I really don't. My vehicle is still pretty good. It doesn't really have a lot of issues. And for an SUV, it should have a range of 300 miles. That's what I'm looking for in an SUV, is have a range of 300 miles. The Rivian R2 was kind of the vehicle I was looking to get. Best case, under ideal circumstances, maybe it would get 300 miles, but really they're saying right now, most of the tests are more like 250 to 260 miles of range. So I think that they should have gone with the bigger battery. Again, it's a box on wheels. I think the efficiency numbers that were out there were somewhat inflated also, but I would definitely get the Rivian R2 had the range been 300 miles. So I'm kind of hoping that next year, the year after, it'll get an upgrade and maybe get a little closer to the actual 300 mile range. I consider myself a mainstream buyer. I'm not an early adopter. If I was, I might already have a Tesla or I might have some other vehicle out there. I never liked the look of the Tesla, so that's a really hard sell for me to get that. I'm not a minimalist person. I kind of want a little bit going on in the vehicle. I got it. Full self-driving is supposed to be really good, and a lot of people really like that. I like driving. I don't drive enough to worry about full self-driving. I can see a benefit of it as you age, where full self-driving, maybe you are no longer safe to drive, whereas full self-driving can get you to the grocery store and back without any issues. I can see some benefits in that. So I'm hoping the technology gets there, but currently I don't really need it. But that's something that I'm hoping that Rivian will have, along with the increased range. Can charging become reliable and convenient? I tend to think we're heading there, especially now that Walmart's installing chargers. I think Costco is talking about doing chargers also. So we're getting to a point where chargers are going to be more available pretty much everywhere. especially outside of California, because all the chargers right now are primarily in California, especially Tesla. But with Ayana and Walmart and all the different people that are starting to get into the charging side, I think we're going to start to see that it is going to be more reliable and more convenient, because you can just go to the Walmart and charge. The bigger problem is universities, where you've got, the mass student dorms and that kind of stuff, and apartment buildings. I think that the US has to do a lot more work in this area. We're starting to see it a little bit more so in blue states. So if you're in a blue state, you're probably seeing a little bit better EV charger rollout. Funny enough, Texas actually has quite a bit of infrastructure going in. I wouldn't have necessarily expected that, but if there's a state that makes sense for solar to be everywhere, it's Texas, because you got, wide open areas where solar makes a lot of sense. And even the oil companies are starting to put it on their land because they see the writing on the wall of where things are going. Can utilities and permitting keep up? This kind of goes into some of these good paying job options. If we put more focus on EVs or some of this renewable technology, I tend to think that it's going to create a lot of jobs. And this was one of those things from the previous administration, actually, with their infrastructure plan and their push on renewables. Is that's essentially what they were trying to do. That doesn't necessarily fix the older generation that has already been doing certain kinds of jobs their entire life. It would have created a whole new job market for some of the younger generation to potentially move into. And we're seeing that even with data centers and AI and stuff like that. There's a huge push for electricians to put these things together. So we're seeing a lot more of those kinds of jobs. It would have been the same thing on EVs and renewables. And that was kind of the bet, was we should prioritize this switch so we can bring all these high-tech jobs into the US. And then obviously the more important part is the supply chain. And are we going to have to import it, or are we going to start building it inside the US? I tend to think that we have the capability to build it in the US. I tend to think we'll probably use more AI to do that rather than hiring people. But there are plenty of jobs, whether it's EV charger manufacturing, electricians is going to be a key one. AI is not going to be able to go out there and do the electrician type stuff, at least not in the immediate future. Maybe we'll start seeing robots out there eventually that have the dexterity to do this kind of stuff. I don't think so. I think the electricians are pretty safe until robots start to look like us, and then we may have a problem. Doing grid upgrades, transformer, switchgear. So there is a ton of job potential in this tech sector if we were to adopt it. A lot more jobs than our continued insistence on using fossil fuels. But again, that's just my take on things. I tend to think that doing all this stuff, whether it's the solar, the batteries, the EVs, was a great way to get jobs into the US. But apparently not everybody agrees with that, and we're going fossil fuels. So oil refineries are doing great right now. And then for potentially some business opportunities, again, I mentioned it, the gas stations, 122,000 gas stations out there. We're going to need a lot of EV charging stations. Some of them, I think the better ones are the ones that are manned. So that's what you had with a gas station. I tend to think that there is a market for that. So these are small business opportunities for people that open up essentially a gas station, but geared towards EV charging. So you've got your food and your drinks, or maybe you partner with something like McDonald's and you offer some other options in there. I think there's a possibility for that. And we're starting to see foreign investors that are coming in and creating places like that versus people in the US that could have done the exact same thing. Again, we're not the experts because we continue to run away from it. So the countries that have embraced it are becoming the experts, and they're coming here and getting those jobs and those businesses. So that's my take on things. Now, there's a lot more stuff that was covered in those articles. I encourage you to go check them out. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Let me know in the comments. What do you think the US should be doing when it comes to EVs or some of this renewable technology? Are you planning on getting an EV? Do you already have one? I'm curious. Let me know in the comments. That's pretty much it for today. Until next time.